Good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
Welcome. I think what you'll be able to do is, if you're familiar with Zoom, if you want to log in to ask a question, just hold the space bar down and you should be able to talk live at that point. But I'm going to try to leave mine open, and then Jen will moderate for us. She's going to tackle anybody who tries to take over, I think. So I don't think there's anybody here who's going to try to dominate, do you? Maybe Alan. Yeah, the other Alan. Well, I hope all of you have had a chance to take a look at the 4 sessions that I pre-recorded and that got posted. I don't have any opening kinds of statements that I think I need to make, other than to say that what I tried to do was to set the disciples within the context of the history of the Christian church, and looking at partially at the issue of where various movements in Christianity draw their sense of authority for authentic faith, for meaning and truth within the Christian faith. And looking at that development down through the years and where that sort of thing comes from. So that was the kind of context I was trying to set in the historical period. And then the 3rd session, I tried to look at some of the major themes, theological themes, that have been characteristic of the disciples down through our existence leading up to today. And then the final session looking specifically at the question of polity, how we go about running the business of being the church and establishing ourselves as a denomination as well as regions and congregations. So I don't know if any of you have already input any questions, or if you want to just do that live, we can do it live if that's the way you prefer to do it. So I'm ready for any questions that might have been raised from your engagement with my 4 sessions that I posted. So who wants to start us off?
I will. Will any of those videos that you've posted be available afterwards?
Yes, they're all going to be available through the regional office and their website.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I don't know for how long, but they are going to be available. I see that there are 21 of us logged on at this point, so that's good. Alan, what kinds of questions do you think your snowbird might raise from those things that were posted?
Well, I must confess, I did download them, but haven't listened to them yet. So my apologies, but they are downloadable, and I do have them ready when I'm going back and forth to Sebring to listen to them.
That's a good way to do it. That's a good way to do it. All righty. Hi, Steve. Have you had history polity at Phillips yet?
I have.
Okay, good, good. How did what I did square with the information that you got in your courses?
It just touched the surface. It was great. It probably just enough for board members to and elders to at least, if they've had some of it before, either refresh a memory or at least teach who we are. Right,
right. I mentioned in one of the videos, one of the things you might consider doing in your congregation, under disciples.org, there is one downloadable. It's a little 2-page thing I'm going to stick up just for you to take a look at. It's called Discover the Disciples. It's a little 2-page thing, and you can either, I've just printed this one off directly from the website, or you can also order them in bulk from disciples.org. It is a very handy, quick kind of introduction to the major issues that make the disciples somewhat distinctive. When I'm in conversation with my colleagues and friends who are from other denominations, particularly the United Methodist Church, since I taught in a United Methodist college for 30 years, the kinds of things that they don't quite understand about us are, first of all, our sense of congregational related polity rather than the more top-down hierarchical polity that the Methodist churches operate out of. And the other is celebrating communion every Sunday. They can't quite figure out how we keep that fresh doing that each time we get together and worship. So those are two issues I think that many other denominations have difficulty with when they try to understand who disciples are and what makes us different from some other churches.
You shared that little brochure, and you're probably familiar with Channing E. Beatty's Disciple,
Yes.
which is for a while they did not have that in print, I believe. I couldn't get it, but now it's back in print. How does that square with what would be pretty pure for disciple history and polity and beliefs?
I think it's pretty accurate as I recall when it was in print before. I haven't seen the more updated version if they've edited that at all, but I always used that when I was a pastor, introducing the disciples to people who were visiting our church so they could understand where we came from. I've always appreciated what they did with that.
Yeah, I used it quite a bit in the military, probably gave up 3,000 or 4,000 of them over the years.
Yeah.
And folks appreciated that, it seemed like.
Alan, I was just going to say that one of the things that, I thought about the video presentation is Reverend Day at Brandon Christian Church did a Bible study using this book. This is Cummins' A Handbook for Today's Disciples.
Yes.
Your video did a really great job where people wouldn't necessarily have to read the chapters that are in here, but it kind of serves as what's in the chapters. And the way that she did that, which I thought was a really great way, was that it was really a Bible study and not a study of these chapters, so that people were asked to read the chapters. And then when we came together, it was a Bible study around the verses that reinforced the chapters. So
Right.
If people were to read this and watch your videos, it's really a great way to do that.
Yeah, and that's consistent with what I understand to be the history of our church. We have always started from what the scriptures say and moved from that to how we go about organizing and doing what we are as church. So the way that you're describing is consistent with that approach. Okay, it looks like we've got 25 of us up now. So what other kinds of questions were raised by your interaction with those videos?
Well, maybe I'm taking up too much time. If there isn't another question at the moment, my question is kind of a practical question. And I think Alan, that on November 1st, I begin as the transitional minister at Royal Palm Christian Church in Coral Springs. So one of the things, as I have been gathering the last 6 weeks or so, some information about what they've done and where they are, where in process would you recommend that I do the same kind of Bible study about who we are?
Your first job and your first responsibility is going to be getting to know the congregation and who they are and what issues are present. So rather than trying to come in with a kind of a preconceived, this is where we're going and this is what I'm going to do as pastor. Getting to know them and getting to have them know you, and the issues that are important to the congregation will emerge out of that relationship. So I don't think, from what I know of that congregation, I don't think that's a major problem that they have had historically. A lack of knowledge about the disciples, but I'm sure that's an issue that we could all use some refresher on. I see Jen has her bird perching on her head again.
Yes, that would be my associate pastor, you know, and they have to always talk.
That's true.
Lana posted in the chat, she says that I went to the United Methodist Divinity School and had two United Methodist churches, and the exact things Alan Smith just mentioned. Congregational polity versus Episcopal polity and their approach to communion is what caused me to search for a different denominational approach. I happily found it in the disciples. Lana, I think a lot of us have.
Yeah. In my experience in pastoring churches and growing up in the disciples church, an awful lot of people who become disciples come there from somewhere else, and find their home with us because they have not found what they are comfortable with in the denominational background or the congregational background they grew up in. And they find a welcoming house here, a place that they can move in and live. So that's always been the way that I've seen people becoming disciple who didn't grow up that way. I remember, Lana, from our conversations with you when you were working with the Commission on the Ministry about that very issue. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm allowed to comment,
Absolutely.
but okay. So I really went into quite a bit of discernment about that, because I really did love Drew Theological School, and I learned such a great school. The focus is, of course, Polity and history and theory, which I loved. But I grew up, as you may remember, in a Middle Eastern Christian home, okay? Right. And I was used to Eastern Orthodox traditions and Near Eastern cultural traditions. And I can tell you the family table was sacred. And my grandmother would make our bread, and we would all sit around the table making it, and she would be doing prayers over it as she made it. So communion has always been, to me, the most sacramentally inclusive act that there is. I mean, I don't even know if that's the correct way to say it, but it's very, very high importance to me in terms of what I'm looking for in a denomination. The other thing that I don't know what happened. Well, I do know what happened to the United Methodist Church, but I don't like a hierarchical polity. I don't think it reflects the first century communities. I don't think it actually think what Christ was demonstrating was advocacy against hierarchical policies and polities and structures, because you can't be inclusive, really truly inclusive, if you're hierarchical. So
right.
Yeah, so that's just what, I'm so happy I found the disciples. That's all I have to say.
And Kimberly has that same kind of background as well, coming out of the United Methodist Church and United Methodist Seminary too, correct?
It was a Wesleyan seminary. I went to Asbury.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, pretty much. But yes, I totally agree.
One of the other things that became clear to me as I was working on these sessions um, is the importance of the term covenant in what disciples understand about their relationships among the three levels, if you will, or the three forms of being church: the general church, the regional church, and the congregational church, as well as the individuals within each of those. Covenant means that we agree to be together, and we respect each other and each other's role in making us better at being ourselves. So rather than looking at the general church up here, and the chart that I posted still has a triangle, and it still has the general church at the top. You know, that might not be the best graphic form of it, but rather than seeing it hierarchically as this group has all the truth and it passes it down, trickles down, if you will, to the other levels. The disciples have historically at least intended to be more horizontal in the way in which they relate those three areas or three manifestations of the church that work together in a shared agreement. We are who we are because we're trying to be the body of Christ on the earth, and we do that best by doing it together. Yeah, keep holding it down, Elizabeth.
Oh.
Okay, I can't hear you yet. Keep the space bar held down like in a walkie-talkie.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to what you mentioned and several of you talked about with one of the characteristics of a lot of disciples churches, not everyone that I've served, but one of the characteristics is that people are coming from other backgrounds. I'm noticing that as time goes on, increasing. And the church that I'm serving now, which is in Lehigh Acres, there are very few people with a Disciples of Christ background. So the information that you're giving us today and that are in those videos is very helpful. And if you look over at James Dunn, who's really Jimmy, I invited him to join with us. He serves our church in the capacity of director of music, and he's our main administrator, and he is a Catholic deacon. And we have quite a few Catholics at our church. So I think knowledge of who we are, where we came from is really getting more and more important these days.
Yeah, and one of the things that a lot of studies have demonstrated is when I was growing up, if I from a disciples church in where I grew up in First Christian Church in Cleveland, Tennessee, which is where I grew up and where I was ordained. If I were moving from Cleveland, Tennessee to someplace else, growing up and as a young adult, my first thought would have been to look for another Disciples of Christ church. And that's the way most of us were raised, to continue to look for that connection that we feel comfortable with. The fluidity and mobility of the population of the United States right now makes that paradigm a lot less common. People look for a congregation where they feel comfortable rather than necessarily a congregation that is part of their historical background, you know, the denomination they grew up in. And so we've always had people becoming disciples who were the result of one spouse being Catholic and the other being Baptist, and looking for something somewhere in between. You know, that's been a part of where disciples have come from historically. Um, a lot people are more likely to be church shopping now than to be loyal to their denomination. So knowing something about what makes us who we are is paramount, I think, at this point in time.
Kimberly has a very good question.
Okay.
She says that, I wonder how being disciples of Christ will help us going forward in a post-pandemic society.
Kimberly, you always have good questions.
Thank you. The part that I didn't say in that is what part of being DOC will help or not help us? Maybe.
Well, I think a part of it is that, as I tried to emphasize in the videos, disciples have always trusted the role of wisdom, of reason in faith. There are very few disciples that I know who are uncomfortable with science. Many of us are willing to say the scientists know where we are going with this pandemic and how we best respond to it in a way that is consistent with who we have been historically. We've always been a very empirical, pragmatic church, and have applied the contributions of a scientific approach to the world consistently throughout our history. I don't think there's going to be any issue with our congregations following the recommendations of the CDC and things of that sort, generally. Now, the caveat to that is disciples are also fiercely independent, which means that congregation A and congregation B are not going to approach it the same way. You know, we will find disciples congregations who are rebelling against the idea of wearing masks and washing our hands. We'll find others that are right down the line with all the recommendations that are coming from our scientific and medical community. So I think we are well equipped historically in our understanding of who we are as a church to respond to where we're going with this pandemic response in a very positive kind of way. You have anything related further with that, Kimberly? Kathy?
Jonathan has a question too.
Okay, Jonathan. Good.
Good morning.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm always interested in different people's perspectives on the role of pastor, elder, and deacon. Yeah, because I grew up in an area that believed seminary was not necessary to be a pastor, but it certainly does not hurt to do so. And I've approached, we talked about this in the commission, I've approached ministry that way over my life. I've always tried to do it while learning about it at the same time. And actually, I lived most of my life within a half-hour's drive of Cane Ridge, where this big wild party got started anyway. So I think I think the elder system was based in that cultural belief in the Appalachian Mountains of God will call you to serve first, and then you figure it out as you go. So how do you interpret pastor, elder, and deacon in our leadership structure?
When I was growing up in the church, the congregations I grew up in would not refer to the pastor as reverend. They would refer to the pastor as either pastor or brother. because the idea of reverend sounds too much like the ordained clergy are in a different status of ministerial calling and responsibility and identity than people in the laity. Um, for the disciples, ordained ministers had the same status as an elder. They're consistent with each other. In the Methodist Church, you have elders' orders, which is where the fully ordained, fully connected person in the denomination is identified. And then deacon is a subset of that. That's not quite fully ordained. Functionally, the pastor is another one of the elders, perhaps the lead elder of the congregation, but another one of the elders for the congregation. And the way in which we have approached communion has been related to that kind of self-identity. Typically, the pastor or the preacher or the ordained minister is going to bring the congregation to the table, perhaps recite the words of institution, but the elders are going to be the ones who pray over the elements. From the Catholic tradition, that would be unthinkable, because for the Catholic tradition, praying over the elements was the role of the priest that would transform the physical elements into the spiritual presence of the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. And only the clergy were holy enough to do that. That's one of the things that our founders rejected and railed against more frequently than almost anything else, with that sense of the clergy being higher than and more holy than other leaders in the church. In the videos, I referred to that as a kind of a radical sense of the priesthood of all believers. We tend to see ourselves as ordained ministers as ministers with a specifically identifiable role within the congregation, but one that's not necessarily more holy or more sacred than anyone else's role. Got it? Any further? I didn't say much about the deacons in that response, but again, as I was growing up, the role of the deacon was to prepare communion. In fact, where I was growing up, the deaconess prepared the communion, and then the deacons distributed it through the congregation. And there was a clear separation between what the deacon does and what the elder does. That has, I think, thankfully begun to, that kind of bifurcation or trifurcation of the roles has begun to fade away a little bit. As for the issue of education and those kinds of things, the general approach of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ is that ordained ministers should have a seminary degree from an approved seminary of the American Theological Society. Right?
Lana has a question.
Sure.
She says, why is the only church we are in direct communion with the UCC? Is it because of our congregational polity?
Partially. One of the four major church denominational strands that became the United Church of Christ was the congregational churches that are very, very present up in the Northeast, where you were for quite a while, Lana. The Barton W. Stone side, the Christian churches, had some connection with that congregational movement. It wasn't exactly the same as the Puritans and the Congregationalists up in Massachusetts and the Northeast, but it's that kind of congregational churches connection that made us kind of natural cousins with the UCC. The other way that we are connected is that in terms of theological approach, and in terms of stance in social justice issues, the disciples and the UCC have always seen each other as being complementary to one another. Yeah, we've felt very comfortable with each other's theological and social positions down through the years. And the disciples, as far as other denominations are concerned, would be considered, I mentioned this in passing in one of the videos, moderate to just left of moderate among the denominations. The UCC would be a little bit left of moderate to radical among the denominations. So that kind of connection with the moderately liberal side of the UCC has made us feel very comfortable with one another. Another denomination we've always had some good relationship with is the American Baptist churches. Not the Southern Baptists, but the American Baptist churches. And that's at least partially because of that brief period when the disciples were related with the Mahoning Baptist Association up around the Pittsburgh and Ohio area over the issue of adult believers' baptism. So there's been that connection with the American Baptist Church. There was a point, since it was very clear that my teaching career was going to always be related closely with the United Methodist Church, when I explored the possibility of dual standing with the United Methodist Church. And my response that I got was, we don't do that. My response to them was, oh, that's fun. We do. So
So
the
just quick,
the major point where we have difficulties with the UCC is over the issue of polity. They still are still uncomfortable with the rather elevated role of the laity in the ministry of the church in a lot of ways. And that's especially present in the way that we go about celebrating communion. They still are convinced that that's the role of the ordained pastor, not the lay elder.
I couldn't agree with you more, because the third church I had was the UCC PCUSA joint denominational
Right,
church,
right.
Northeast. So everything you have said is right on the money. I just have one follow-up question. How would it be valuable for us to consider, or possible, I guess the better question, valuable or possible to consider direct communion with, or some type of relationship with PCUSA, the Lutheran Church? I always forget which synod is the more liberal one, and the Episcopalians.
Yeah. There was a movement back in when the ecumenical movement was first exploding in the late 60s. The early stages of that sounded like a lot of the Protestant denominations were trying to push toward a merger of denominations so that we all became one big happy family as the Protestant churches, basically, the participating or cooperating Protestant denominations. So the language that was used a lot was marriage, that we were going to marry each other. And the conclusion at the end of the 60s was we would rather just live together than get married. You know, we celebrate the things we can do together. There are a lot of missions that the disciples and the UCC hold jointly. There are some regions where the same office is the UCC office and the disciples office. In Israel, the mission in Israel is a joint disciples UCC mission. So that has been the direction we have taken, is to see places that we can combine our efforts and combine our witness in ways that make us more effective than we might be able to be separately. Yeah. Susanna, you look like you're starting to say something.
No, I'm just horribly amused.
As you typically are. Did we lose you, Susanna?
There's one of the areas for UCC, a couple of things with UCC and disciples. One, we do global ministries completely joined. We
Yeah.
actually have our global ministries offices are equally in Indianapolis and in Columbus, Ohio. And all of our partners in ministry who are under the aegis of global ministries are fully, it's doesn't matter whether they are DOC or UCC, they are it's all the same. So that's one area where we really have joined on that. And then there are some other areas where we do a lot of work with other denominations, sometimes directly with denominations and sometimes through I guess what we might call parachurch ecumenical movements, where we instead of trying to do it all on our own, Church World Service is an example that I think a lot of our churches support, and that would be an area where we work with other denominations, not only in the United States but throughout the world, and that's been an area. I grew up in a Southern Baptist background, in a church that was very very mission minded, and so one of the things that I looked for when I became a disciple was, how do we do missions, and who are our missionaries? And you know, I spent the first part of my adult life as a Presbyterian minister's daughter-in-law, and I was used to doing all this work for overseas missions, for home missions, and it's one of the areas that I sometimes think we don't do enough with, and that might be an area where as we look at how to be more ecumenical, that we might consider how we work with other churches of other denominations in doing missions of all sorts. I mean, I have probably rolled 20 miles of bandages for a hospital in Africa.
Right.
That sort of thing. So I mean, there are ways, that we might, as we move forward and as we think about it, and I think that one of the ways that might happen is through our laity. As people come from different traditions, and I think we probably are all in churches where possibly a majority of the people did not grow up discipled, that it would be an area where we might find people feeling more at home if they saw us doing some of the things that they have always done, and missions are really one area where we could maybe do that.
Yeah, and that's a good follow-up to the question that Kimberly asked earlier in relation to the pandemic. One of the things the pandemic is reminding us of is the church is what we do in mission rather than where we meet. Among the things that the pandemic has opened up for us is the possibility of focusing more on what our mission is as Christians rather than where we gather on a particular Sunday morning. And we can do that probably more effectively together with people from other churches than just our small body of folks. I mean, face it, most of our congregations are well under 200 members. And most of them are under 100, to be quite honest with you. So the critical mass of doing effective missions is limited if it's only your congregation trying to do that. So ecumenism is for many disciples at this point in history going to be interchurch missions, and seeing that as our responsibility as Christians rather than necessarily as disciples only.
I'd like to, if it's all right, share one. I'm a church history nerd, and so I'm enjoying hearing all of this discussion. But one of the, I think there's so much power in our own church history and connecting that with the church where we are today. And one of the things that when Margaret was talking, it reminded me, one of the, well, when I say latest, the last 5 to 10 years of philosophy of mission work is really to look in our own backyard, and
Right.
and not necessarily like back in the 1800s where or even in the 70s and 80s where we're going to go and change you, but more of a give and take, a relationship building. So what that might look like with the people in our own congregations, using their gifts and talents and from different denominational backgrounds, and going from there, because they have, I am sure, connections with community members as well. So I think it's there's to me so much power and excitement, really understanding where we do come from, because again, we've talked, kind of hit on some of these things. Alexander and Stone Campbell and all they came from different religions. And I mean, you said it much kinder than I would. I just said they didn't get along and they had to move on. But but I love that. That's what I love, because there's so much reality to our church history, and we can learn from that, and we can bring that in to say, this is where we came from, but really this is where we are today. We're learning how to get along with others that may not see things differently. And that is one of, I would say, the staples, the foundations, I don't know, I use that word loosely a little bit, of disciples of Christ, is wanting to bring in everybody. And I'm seeing that in this conversation today.
Yeah, I don't know much about the personalities of the other 3 founders, but I know Alexander Campbell was not easy to get along with. Yeah, he was pretty irascible and enjoyed making people angry, especially in his debates.
Well, and for me, I could, when I would read about that, I laughed because I don't know about you, but for me, I have people like that. I have people like that in my family. They're right and no one else is right.
Yep.
And so I was like, oh yes, I can totally connect. And so that's what I mean why I love our history, is it's so real, and it really can be. On the occasions that I do preach, I will often bring in church history, because to me it's so lively, and I think there really is meaning and connection. And when I'm hearing the discussion today, I'm like, I think there's strands that we can bring in and connect from our polity and history. So
Good. Did you folks find the discussion in the polity session where I used what the Commission on the Ministry does as a way of kind of a test case of the covenant relationship among the various manifestations of the church? Did you find that a helpful way of approaching that discussion? For those of you that made it all the way through the 4th session. So rather than just say, this is what we do, and line it out in bullet points, I used a case study to show how that relationship, that covenant relationship operates.
I have a question that's moves kind of away from theoretical to something very practical. How, in your various congregations and in your various disciples' experiences, besides preparing communion and serving the elements, how do your deacons function in your congregations?
Yeah, that's kind of where Jonathan was trying to go a little earlier as well.
You know, some specific things that your deacons actually do, you know, beyond showing up at board meetings or something of that sort. What else do they, is there anything they do?
Yeah. It's been many years since I've served a congregation as pastor, so I'll defer.
Prepare communion.
Can you hear me right now?
Yes.
It's Libby. In churches I've served in the past, the ongoing function of the deacons was to do the work, and they would be the ones who staffed food kitchens and just all the mission stuff and projects out in the community of different kinds, and trips to needy places for a week to repair homes. And they were the ones who did all that. And the elders were considered the spiritual leaders of the church, and they would make sure that there were plenty of faith development classes and spiritual retreats and opportunities like that, and special prayer things. And that's kind of how the way that's worked. Those were in larger churches.
Yeah, and then the elders would engage in like hospital visitation and things of that nature as well,
Yes.
which the deacons didn't typically do. Again, as a restoration movement in the disciples' history, the discussion of the difference between the apostles who become essentially the elders and the deacons was that the apostles focused on preaching and saving souls and teaching and those kinds of things, whereas the deacons, the word diakonos is translated as minister or servant, whereas the deacons were the ones that made sure that the poor had food to eat, and that the widows were being taken care of, and that the sick were being administered to in the congregation. So their focus was more on the social issues within the congregation and making sure that the ministry was serving the physical needs, the social needs, and in some cases, medical needs of the congregation, rather than the more quote unquote spiritual functioning that tended to be done by people like the elders. So the Restoration movement tended to make those kinds of separations between those functions. My experience at this point in history is that there's not a whole lot of difference in terms of role between the elders and the deacons in the administration of the church board, for example, or the administrative council, or whatever it is that your congregation calls that governing group. The elders and the deacons pretty much share those responsibilities in most of our churches now. But my stepfather was among the most loyal, faithful people in my congregation, home congregation in Cleveland, Tennessee. He was there every time the doors were open, and he usually was the one who opened the doors, unlocked the doors. He's the one that ran the lawnmower, you know, to mow the churchyard and repaired things that were going on. And he was a deacon, and he felt very, very uncomfortable when people would say, Bud, you need to be an elder. And he was uncomfortable because he didn't see himself as someone who spoke and prayed in public. He saw himself as having a ministry that he wanted to limit to the kinds of things that he felt comfortable in and equipped to do. And he was afraid of what he would say when he was up at the table, blessing the elements of communion. He didn't feel equal to that task. It wasn't part of his self-understanding. Still a very important minister of the congregation, but he didn't feel comfortable with the idea of being an elder. So he was one of the most active deacons there was. By the way, when my mother retired from that leadership role in that congregation, which included being the church organist, she was also the one that made communion every Sunday. So that the room, the sacristy, other denominations would call it, where communion was prepared, when she retired, was named after her. So again, she would never think of herself as an elder.
This has been, I know we may or may not be ready to terminate, but I wanted to tell you, man, I'm excited now. And this time I'm really going to listen to your lectures, and I mean it.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you. I say at the beginning that they're all roughly 30 minutes in length. Roughly I mean that very approximate.
I think it's 26, 27, 28, and 32.
Yep. If you do all the introduction and saying goodbye stuff, yeah, take all that out.
I mean, if you're looking for a light read for the history, you can't see it with it's Disciples in the Bible by Eugene Boring. It's, I mean, I just think, but again, I am a church history nerd. I will tell you, I grew up in the Church of Christ, so I'm reading this and I'm yelling at the book. And
Yeah.
so it's, because again, any history written is perspective. It's, and so if you really want to just get a good perspective, I recommend Disciples in the Bible. It's a great light read. And it's, to me, it's, I'm not trying to, it's entertaining. It'll draw you in. It's not like, oh no, history. So if you're not a history fan, but I think it gives a good solid picture. So Disciples and the Bible by Boring, who is not boring.
Gene is a wonderful guy. He is a great teacher and a wonderful New Testament scholar.
Oh.
Yeah. And I actually have prepared a one-page bibliography of readings and disciples' background. If you folks are interested, I can send that to the region for posting and making that available as well. Just a simple one-page bibliography. I mean, most of us who grew up in disciples-related seminaries either grew up with Garrison de Groot's History of the Christian Church or the McAllister Tucker, Journeys in Faith. Those are two big volumes that give you way more information than any of you probably need to know. But there's several other things that are very helpful as well. Ron Osborne has a small handbook for today's disciples. It's really quite good too. So I've got that available that I can send to the region for those of you who might be interested in that as well. Any other issues or questions? We've got 6 minutes or so left in our allotted time.
Rachel, if you would like to share the information on that book in our chat, so
Yeah.
that way others can also get that book, that would be very awesome.
Absolutely. And to be honest, I'll put it up there, but before you go buy it, your church library or another church library, another disciples may have a couple of copies, or even, another pastor. I bought it because I've gone through it and gone through it. It's a great read. I will put it in now and stop talking. So
Sounds good.
Also want to put that that Pastor Betsy did pop in to say hello. She says popping in to say thank you to Dr. Alan Smith for providing this opportunity for conversation, plus the 4 pre-recorded videos. These are on the website and will be offered ongoing at floridadisciples.org. They would be a great use for your congregations for future study and discussions as well.
Yeah. Let me share just one anecdote in closing. On the one of the hallmarks of the disciples has always been our commitment to Christian unity. Christian unity is our polar star, as Barton Stone would have said. When Sharon Watkins was the preacher at Barack Obama's inauguration, for the prayer breakfast that followed the inauguration, Sharon Watkins was the preacher for that occasion. And her husband, Rick, who is a very, very fine Old Testament scholar, was seated on the front row of the people that were present there. And seated next to him was a very prominent Muslim imam. And as Sharon was preaching and became more and more into her delivery and the kinds of important things that she was saying, this guy that was sitting next to Rick was literally bouncing on his feet because he was so excited from what he was hearing. So when everything was over and people were approaching Sharon for their congratulations, this imam was so excited he was literally dancing from one foot to the other, bouncing and all, and he wanted desperately, he says, I wanted to come hug Sharon and thank her for that wonderful ecumenical, interreligious kind of message that she delivered. But as a Muslim, I cannot touch a woman who is not a member of my family, especially not one who is not my wife. I can't touch her, so I can't hug her. So he reached over and he hugged Rick. So thanks all of you for your attention, your participation. I appreciated the questions. And I hope you will continue to get some benefit from the sessions that are recorded. Hope they have a life beyond what we do here on this weekend in October. Thanks all of you.